This is a crisis on top of a crisis. It is raining like crazy. It's not going to stop raining. This is no ordinary rain. This is a monsoon. And what's happening, what's already happened, is there are mudslides. But that's not where it stops. I mean, look, and here's a latrine, but the latrines are filthy. And what happens the rain. Here comes the rain.
Than to go home.
Here comes the rain.
Testing, testing. Mic 1, testing, testing, testing. Testing, testing. Mic 1, testing. Can you hear me? Am I hearing anything? Testing, testing. Mic 1, testing. Good?
All right, if members, if you'll take your seat, we're going to call this hearing to order. For more than 3 decades, the government of Burma has systematically denied the Rohingya people even the most basic of human rights. Add to that no access to education, no access to health care. Last year, this persecution reached a new low, horrific levels, as the Burmese military drove 700,000 Rohingya from their homes, burning villages, killing scores, doing so-called terrorist clearance operations. That's what the military there calls it, as they drive people to their death. One Rohingya survivor recalled the attacks on his village, saying, "The whole village was under random fire like rain." Just this week, the State Department released a report detailing stomach-turning, systematic, and widespread acts of violence against the Rohingya in northern Rakhine State. The report includes gruesome accounts of burning elderly alive in their homes, gang-raping women, and slaughtering fleeing refugees. The Burmese military made no distinction between men, women, and children. One woman recalls watching as, to quote her words, newborns and children who could barely walk, they threw them in the river, while she desperately hid in bushes across from that river. It is hard to hear these accounts without feeling queasy, but we must catalog these atrocities so that we can one day hold the perpetrators accountable. And I want to commend the administration for speaking out against these atrocities. Ambassador Nikki Haley, in particular, has repeatedly demanded that the international community not ignore the plight of the Rohingya, and that the U.S., as you know, we're providing desperately needed humanitarian assistance to the survivors, many who are now refugees in Bangladesh. But I encourage the administration to go further. This is more than just a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. To all who have met with Rohingya refugees, who have heard these accounts, it is clear that these crimes amount to genocide. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, signed and ratified by the United States, defines genocide as certain acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Those acts include, among others, killing members of the ethnicity or religion, causing serious bodily or mental harm to that ethnicity, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births. I believe that a realistic accounting of the deliberate campaign of murder, of intimidation, and displacement against the Rohingya clearly meets this legal standard for genocide. Making a formal determination of genocide must be the next step for the U.S. Defining these atrocities for what they are is critical to building international public awareness and support to stop them. The protection of human rights has long been our nation's top priority in Burma, dating back to freeing Aung San Suu Kyi, and today that must include protection of the Rohingya people. The Burmese government and its military must ensure the protection of all the people of Burma, regardless of their ethnic background or their religious beliefs. Those military leaders and security forces responsible for these atrocities must face justice. The U.S. must push the civilian leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, to rise to this challenge. Confronting genocide of the Rohingya is a moral issue and a national security issue. No one is more secure when fanaticism and unchecked violence are growing in this part of the world. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues today, and now I turn to Mr. Elliot Engel, our ranking member from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Pomper, I'm aware of the good work that you do, and Ms. Van Susteren, it's good to see you again. From the first time I appeared on your show, I was always a big fan. So thank you both for being here. Our last hearing on this topic, roughly a year ago, took place at the height of the horrific violence against the Rohingya. We saw startling evidence of what was taking place and heard about the desperate humanitarian crisis which, despite heroic efforts, is sadly no less dire today. More than 700,000 refugees, 70% of whom are women and children. You know, it's interesting because our congressional districts all have about 700,000 people each in them. So every member of Congress could imagine if every person who lived in your congressional district were refugees, imagine what it would be like. That's the magnitude of the problem. 70% of these 700,000 are women and children, and they now live in the world's largest refugee camp in its entirety. The constant risk of losing their temporary shelters to monsoon rains and all kinds of other tragedies. In the last year, though, we've also learned more about who is responsible. The Burmese military has claimed that this brutal crackdown is the response to a clash that took place on August 25th of last year. This is simply not true. Ample evidence shows that the Burmese military and police forces used this campaign to specifically target Rohingya civilians, to target them with rape, with indiscriminate killing, with slash-and-burn tactics that have destroyed dozens of villages. The UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission Report has undertaken the most comprehensive investigation to date. It recently called for the UN Security Council to authorize the ICC to investigate and prosecute senior officials in the Burmese military for crimes against humanity, and I quote, and so that a competent court can determine their liability for genocide, unquote. So after a year of unrelenting violence and suffering, what will American policy be? The State Department quietly published its report on these atrocities last week. No announcement, no legal determination about what occurred, no indication of what comes next. I ask, Mr. Chairman, that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Will Secretary Pompeo determine that, I quote, crimes against humanity, unquote, occurred, which is clearly the case? Will he go further and say that crimes occurred with genocidal intent? Will he make the evidence behind the report available to use against the perpetrators of these crimes? I believe he should, as the Burmese government is currently bulldozing Rohingya villages and destroying any evidence that remains. Ambassador Haley announced $185 million in additional humanitarian assistance for the Rohingya and communities in Bangladesh who are hosting refugees. This is welcome news because funding humanitarian relief is necessary, but it isn't a sufficient response, in my opinion, to such a grave human tragedy. There's a range of other steps we should be taking. There are ways we could exercise real leadership to help mitigate this crisis. First of all, the United States should advocate for the UN Security Council to refer this case to the ICC. Instead, the President went in front of the world yesterday and trashed the ICC. We should use our global stature to call this crime what it is, clearly a crime against humanity, and likely also genocide, then rally a strong international commitment to fully fund the latest appeal for humanitarian assistance. Instead, the State Department is using language that lets perpetrators off the hook. The President lobs insults at the international institutions that could make a difference instead of using our leverage to garner more support to address this crisis. We should be true to our history and our values and provide safe haven for men, women, and children who have been driven from their homes. Instead, we're slashing the number of refugees allowed onto our shores, a pittance of 30,000. It's really shameful. The United States, of course, is not to blame for this crisis. The Burmese military, starting with Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Min Aung Hlaing, bears primary responsibility. The blood is on their hands. Aung San Suu Kyi, the civilian leader once also hailed as her country's moral leader, has proven herself, unfortunately, to be part of the problem by failing to speak out, by denying the abuses that have taken place, and for not addressing the apartheid policies and conditions in Rakhine State that set the stage for this catastrophe. I know that Mr. Pomper points this out in his written testimony. But even though we're not responsible for the crisis, for decades American leadership has meant having the moral courage to stand up and do the right thing in the face of this kind of suffering. The administration's policies send a clear message. We're no longer willing to carry that mantle. When it comes to standing up for human rights, for justice, for the rule of law, for the world's most vulnerable and oppressed, the United States has taken itself out of the running. Complex challenges require multifaceted solutions and real leadership, and we are not, in my opinion, exercising either of those. Shame on us. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses what a path forward might look like if the administration were inclined to take it. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. And before we move to our witnesses' testimony, we have a video from Ms. Van Susteren that we're going to play, which includes footage from her recent trip to the refugee camps in Bangladesh.
Here comes the rain.
Yeah, we can go there.
Can I get under your thing for a second? This is what the million people, the million Rohingyas in this refugee camp are having to put up with. This is the monsoon season. This is a crisis on top of a crisis. It is raining like crazy. It's not going to stop raining. This is no ordinary rain. This is a monsoon. And what's happening, what's already happened, is there are mudslides. But that's not where it stops. I mean, look, here's a latrine, but the latrines are filthy. And what happens is they make the water filthy. There's water running all the way through. You can see the water underneath me. It just doesn't stop raining. And it's just a breeding ground for all sorts of diseases. You've got cholera and so many other diseases that come when you have filthy water. And that's just the beginning. But how can anyone expect these people to get food to live? How can you expect their structures to stand up? And now the structures are literally going to wash down upon each other. Bridges are washing away. This is what the spotlight needs to be put on, because these people are desperate. But it's only going to get worse.
The danger is clear to relief workers like May Sepan of Food for the Hungry and Medical Teams International.
Essentially, their settlements are built on what appears to be sand dunes because they're deforested lands that have no way of protecting the population against the monsoon rains. And so it's very likely that most of these settlements will get washed out as the rains increase. And washed out as the rains increase. And that most of these settlements will get washed out as the rains increase. And are built on what appears to be sand dunes because they're deforested lands that have no way of protecting the population against the monsoon rains. And so it's very likely that most of these settlements will get washed out as the rains increase and the storms become more intense.
When the Burmese military attacked, they didn't just kill and set houses on fire. They raped. And the victims of those rapes are here now. They face a terrible stain that their own culture puts on them and on their newborns.
We're seeing a lot of women that are coming in right about now that have voiced to us that the babies are a result of rape.
Rohingya culture is very complicated. Even the rape victims, those who have been raped by Myanmar military, you know what they say? Oh, she have a evil in her belly. Stay away from her.
If you've been raped by the Myanmar
Military, they were saying evil in her belly. Stay away from her. A lot of Rohingya girls, those who have been raped by the Myanmar military, they're hiding. They're hiding. They're suffering quietly, silently. They don't want to expose. They don't want to say. They don't say nothing.
So what do we do? What can we do? What's next for the 1 million people who seem to want little more than to go home?
Thank you, Greta. Let me explain to the members here and to our witnesses. There is some background noise from construction going on in the building, and our director, Tom Sheehy, is in the process of trying to get that stopped. So we will continue here with our hearing. But this morning, I am very pleased to welcome Ms. Greta Van Susteren and Mr. Stephen Pomper to the committee. Greta Van Susteren currently anchors Voice of America's foreign policy show, Plugged In with Greta Van Susteren, and you can access that online, by the way. She has spent 14 years at Fox News, where she hosted the primetime news and interview program On the Record with Greta Van Susteren. She has traveled the world to cover international news stories, and most recently, of course, to Burma to observe the current genocide against the Rohingya. Stephen Pomper currently serves as the United States Program Director for the International Crisis Group. Previously, he was a senior policy scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace and a Davis Distinguished Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He also served on the staff of the National Security Council, where he served as the Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. And we appreciate them both being with us here today. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record. Members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. So if you would, Ms. Van Susteren, please summarize your remarks, and we'll go to you at this time.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Angle, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The video you just saw is a shortened version, but it's a powerful witness to the tragedy unfolding for the Rohingya people. This is pure suffering. I'm here today with Voice of America, part of the UN Agency for Global Media, and I volunteer to host a weekly affairs program, as the chairman noted, at VOA. And as a journalist, my job is simply to tell you what I saw, to tell you the truth. Today I'm sharing my personal observations of the crisis informed by my reporting, and I'd like to share the work of VOA to report on and reach the Rohingya people. My observations should not be construed as official positions of the administration. I've made 4 trips to Myanmar and the surrounding region. My first trip to the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh was in December 2017 in my own capacity. I literally hitchhiked on the back of a cargo plane with an NGO Samaritan's Purse. And I returned with VOA Director Amanda Bennett again to the refugee camp in June of 2018. And as you saw in the video, in June, the monsoon season just devastated the camps. Shelters slipped away in mudslides, walls collapsed around huts and people, and attempts such as basic sanitation were obliterated. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees estimates 800,000 Rohingya refugees from Myanmar are now living in those camps that are adjacent to each other. These people are forgotten, they're stateless, they're homeless, they're nameless. In Myanmar, the government has rejected the use of the term Rohingya. The Rohingya are non-people to them. They have been dehumanized. This attitude was evident in nearly every interaction I've had when I've been in Myanmar. The trauma of the refugees' violent departure from Myanmar is fresh. You saw in the video that pregnant women raped by the Myanmar military are shunned in the community. Children live with memories of unspeakable brutality. One young boy proudly showed me a drawing he produced in an NGO-sponsored art program. I asked him to explain his artwork to me, and at one point I asked, "What is that?" He replied that it was a drawing of a severed, bloody hand. He saw that on the ground near his village home in Myanmar as he fled with his mother. I heard many others speak about the Myanmar military's brutal use of machetes. Well, what do we do now? The international community is aware and concerned, but gaining traction with the Myanmar officials has been difficult. In August 2018, the UN Human Rights Council issued a report documenting atrocities against the Rohingya people. It details the military's mass killing of villagers, raping of women and girls, and the torching of villages. The report recommends that senior military leadership in Myanmar be investigated and prosecuted for a genocide against the Rohingya. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, confirmed that the State Department's own fact-finding report is consistent with the UN report. She was right when she said, "The whole world is watching what we do next and if we act." As journalists, VOA is already acting by covering the crisis from the start for its international audiences, including those in Myanmar. It's risky for VOA reporters in Myanmar to do this. Our reporters have faced pressures to stop using the term Rohingya in their work, but they have resisted. VOA's coverage includes interviews with representatives from the Myanmar and Bangladesh governments, UN officials, human rights organizations, reactions from the State Department, and congressional comments and hearings. I want to emphasize that hearing the views of Congress is of the utmost importance for VOA's international audiences. VOA is also working to directly reach the refugees. Director Amanda Bennett's visit with me to Bangladesh in June was to assess how VOA can better report on and broadcast to the refugees. UNHCR representatives, NGOs in the field, and representatives from the government of Bangladesh were highly supportive. The assessment identified multiple options for delivering content, including radio and listening groups established by NGOs. Director Amanda Bennett and her team also spoke with people living in the camp to learn about their news habits and issue preferences. Without exception, every group, male and female, wanted news and information. They are especially eager to hear news from Myanmar and what the international community is saying about them. Some refugees with prior education recognized the VOA brand. They were also interested in learning English. In April 2018, VOA started transmitting 30 minutes of learning English language across AM and shortwave radio. VOA is also planning to start limited broadcasting in the Rohingya dialect. The value of bringing news and information to the Rohingya cannot be underscored. Left in these camps, long-term, they will lack economic opportunity, be targets for human trafficking or exploitation, or violent extremism. VOA News can make a difference. I'm extremely passionate about this project because I see it as contributing to what I hope will be a strong, decisive response by the U.S. government to seek a long-term, peaceful solution for the Rohingya people. In closing, I must acknowledge the efforts of Secretary of State Pompeo and Ambassador Haley to be forceful on this issue. I must also thank the many NGOs that rushed to help the Rohingya people fleeing from Myanmar last year, from Doctors Without Borders to Samaritan's Purse to the World Food Program, and so many more. And finally, thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Ango, for convening this hearing. Journalists must document atrocities as they occurred. Based on my own reporting, I firmly believe this is a pivotal moment for the United States and for being on the right side of history. When we say, never again, we must mean it. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta. Mr. Popper.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today about the atrocities committed against the Rohingya population of Rakhine State and the ongoing human rights and humanitarian disaster that has displaced hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to southeastern Bangladesh. My name is Stephen Pomper, and I am the U.S. Program Director at the International Crisis Group. Previously, I served in a range of policy and legal roles in the U.S. government, which are summarized in my written testimony. Mr. Chairman, The unfathomable horrors that the Rohingya have suffered are documented in 2 recent reports that have received considerable attention. The first is a report by a UN-mandated fact-finding mission, which was cited by Ambassador Haley in her remarks to the Security Council in late August, and which describes the, quote, immediate, brutal, and grossly disproportionate, end quote, operations launched by the Myanmar armed forces known as the Tatmadaw in the aftermath of a cluster of coordinated insurgent attacks in August 2017. That report concludes that the primarily Tatmadaw operations, which included indiscriminate killings, the targeting of children, gang rapes, villages burned to the ground, and people burned alive, suggest by their nature and scope a level of pre-planning by the Tatmadaw. The second is a report by the U.S. Department of State released just the other day, which is based on a survey of over 1,000 Rohingya refugees who have been displaced to camps in the Cox's Bazar region of Bangladesh, and which led the State Department to similar factual findings about the tragic events that unfolded in August 2017 and its aftermath. Mr. Chairman, against this factual backdrop, it is hardly surprising that the UN fact-finding mission found a reasonable basis to conclude that the Tatmadaw and others had committed crimes against humanity and war crimes, and that there was a sufficient basis to investigate and prosecute the crime of genocide. These are all crimes of international concern, the gravest of crimes. Mr. Chairman, primary responsibility for these crimes rests with the Tatmadaw, including its Commander-in-Chief, Min Aung Hlaing, and the other security forces that perpetrated them, and these actors must be held accountable. But Mr. Chairman, this tragedy is all the more bitter because it comes against the backdrop of what not so long ago seemed a promising democratic transition, which installed Aung San Suu Kyi as the senior civilian leader of the Myanmar government. While she lacks control over the military, this does not excuse the fact that Suu Kyi has refused to face the reality of what has occurred, or to use her moral authority to urge the country down a path that could culminate in the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of the Rohingya to their homes. Mr. Chairman, in the face of these terrible facts, the tools and strategies that are available to the United States to provide support to the Rohingya are few, imperfect, and limited. But in order to make progress, it will be important to use them all, and energetically. These tools include targeted sanctions adopted under the Global Magnitsky Executive Order or other available authorities. While not a silver bullet, these can send an important message that may deter other potential bad actors. These tools also include support for international tribunals and courts that enjoy jurisdiction over the crimes in question, as well as an international mechanism that is hopefully being created to collect and preserve evidence for their benefit. These efforts may take time to yield results, but they are the only way to achieve a measure of justice for the victims of these atrocities. These tools include humanitarian support to the Rohingya in Bangladesh and development support to the communities where they are living, which is necessary both to meet the immediate needs of the refugees and to prevent economic burdens from driving a dangerous wedge between them and their hosts. And Mr. Chairman, these tools also include continued engagement with Aung San Suu Kyi's government, which, though frustrating, is the only way to encourage recognition of the catastrophe that the Tatmadaw has wrought and to begin working toward the critical changes required to enable the safe and voluntary return of the Rohingya. Mr. Chairman, there are steps that Congress can take to support this effort. Congress can send a signal of support by sending a delegation to visit Rohingya refugees in their camps. It can ensure that the United States is funding humanitarian and development assistance at generous levels. It can fund efforts that serve the purpose of accountability. And much like it created a powerful human rights tool in the form of the Global Magnitsky Act, Congress could signal its commitment to accountability by enacting a Crimes Against Humanity statute to help ensure that should perpetrators from Myanmar ever set foot on U.S. soil, they would face justice for their crimes. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to share these brief thoughts with the committee, and I will look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it. We've also been joined by Sandy Levin, who's been very passionate about this issue, involved in it for many years, and we appreciate the Congressman being with our committee today on this. Let me begin with a question, because the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, as I indicated, the United States signed it, we ratified it, It defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. When President Reagan signed the legislation ratifying this convention, he said, quote, "I'm delighted to fulfill the promise made by Harry Truman to all the peoples of the world, and especially the Jewish people. This represents a strong and clear statement by the United States that it will punish acts of genocide with the force of law and the righteousness of justice," unquote. Since then, the United States government, often with the encouragement of Congress, has sadly had cause to make several determinations of genocide. We have had to do that, most recently finding that ISIS had committed genocide against religious minorities in Iraq and in Syria. Ms. Van Susteren, based on your reporting, do you believe the actions of the Burmese security forces are designed to destroy, in whole or in part, the Rohingya? And do you agree that these atrocities are being carried out on a massive and shocking scale? Oh,
Mr. Chairman, if I could just break for 1 second, that the reason that finally got signed by President Reagan was because Senator Bill Proxmire from my home state was so forceful in trying to get that finally signed by a U.S. president. It took 40 years. Secondly is that let me speak personally, not on behalf of VOA or the government. I don't speak for them, but I've been there. I've witnessed this. Do I think that it meets the definition? I absolutely do, having witnessed it. I mean, I talked to people, I walked those camps, I talked to them. I mean, this is the Myanmar military elected to push the Rohingya out of their country, and it's a little bit like if 6 people commit an armed robbery in Milwaukee. You don't throw everybody out of Milwaukee. You go after the 6 people. But what they did is they systematically wanted to get rid of the Rohingya, and that's what they did. And of course, it harkens back to the history where they made them in 1982 non-citizens with a constitution. But there's no doubt that it's done on a mass level. It's no doubt that they have been identified. But I should add is that there are other groups in Myanmar, like the Christians, that are likewise getting persecution, but not to the magnitude or the number of people that Rohingya. But it does meet, in my personal opinion, the definition of genocide.
thank you. Also, in talking to some of the survivors, part of the issue has been getting journalists into that affected area. What they share with me is that, you know, the attempt or the effort by the military in Burma to control information gives only one perspective every day to the Burmese people. And so our efforts, both on getting humanitarian assistance in and getting journalists to cover this firsthand in terms of what's happening in Rakhine State, is a huge challenge. It's important that people in the region and throughout the world understand the facts, and it's important they get that information in real time. Sadly, we saw the 2 Reuters reporters convicted on framed charges, and we've heard about the major obstacles that Radio Free Asia is facing. Maybe you could talk about your experiences on this issue and what the VOA is doing in the face of these challenges from the Burmese military in trying to get the information all over the world, but also getting it to the Burmese so they understand what the rest of us are talking about and really comprehend not what the military is telling them is happening in Rakhine State, but what is actually happening up there.
Well, use the word challenges, which is a nice way to say what's really happening. The press isn't getting in. I mean, you've got an instance where a VOA stringer was invited to the Rakhine State, but as part of a press pool with limited access. I've been to North Korea 3 times, and they stand next to you and take notes as you do anything. Well, if you're not allowed in, if you don't have free access, you're not really reporting. You make the best of what you get, but reporters are not getting access to the Rakhine State. I had the ambassador from Myanmar to the United States on my VOA show, and he said that he would take me. I'm still waiting because I would like to go into the Rakhine State, but there's a reason why those 2 reporters who from Reuters are spending 7 years in prison, and that's because they dared to begin reporting on mass graves of Rohingya inside the Rakhine State. But there is no access. I think even Senator Dick Durbin tried to get into the Rakhine State, and the U.S. Senator couldn't get in there. So it's tightly controlled. The news that you do come out that does come out often is the Myanmar military-controlled press. So to suggest that we're getting any accurate news, the best we can do is talk to the survivors, and they're all giving us consistently the same story. We're all hearing the same stories to them, and they're not all getting together and cooking up a story. We're talking individually to them, and they're telling us these horrors. That's the best way we can get this information. But if Myanmar wants to be playing the world stage, they might want to invite journalists in so we can fairly report and not in a controlled environment.
Thank you very much for your testimony. My time's expired. We'll go to Mr. Engel.
I want to again thank our witnesses today. It's very interesting to hear their thoughts, and the chairman and I are of one when it comes to this kind of thing. When we talk about acts of genocide or crimes against humanity, or decide what we call it, why would the U.S. State Department be reluctant, based on all the available evidence, to upgrade its current designation of ethnic cleansing to at least crimes against humanity, if not genocide? Anyone have a thought on that?
I don't speak for the State Department. I don't know what maybe they haven't seen it. I don't know why the State Department doesn't. Maybe there's a legal distinction, but I don't speak for the State Department.
So neither do I anymore. But I would say on this issue, let me not speculate about motivation, but let me just say the findings that were released in the report make pretty much a facial case for crimes against humanity. It doesn't use the term crimes against humanity, but all of the sort of legal predicates are sort of spelled out in language that frankly does have legal weight. They speak about indiscriminate killing, they speak about widespread and large-scale violence, and they speak about premeditation. All of those are the key elements of a crimes against humanity finding. And I don't know why they wouldn't take the extra step there. In the past administrations have struggled with issues around legal characterizations, either because they really had trouble sort of making the legal case to themselves internally, or because they were concerned that announcing a legal conclusion might put a burden on them to take policy actions that they weren't prepared to take. I fear in this context it might be the latter, at least as concerns crimes against humanity, because it seems like such a straightforward determination, and it really seems, based on the way in which the report is written, that they've arrived at that conclusion and just been reluctant to articulate it.
Thank you. The civilian government of Burma seems to be focused on economic development in northern Rakhine State as the way to encourage Rohingya to come home. Notwithstanding the desperate economic conditions there, these efforts seem devoid of an acknowledgement of the systematic denial of basic human rights, which Rohingya in northern Rakhine State have endured for decades. So given the challenges of Rakhine State and the mixed results of peace building and transitional justice initiatives following mass atrocities in other parts of the world, what would potential transitional justice mechanisms look like for Burma? What kind of initiatives should we be supporting as part of a broader policy toward Burma?
Well, first of all, inviting them back, they've got a problem is that, number one, they're non-citizens. They're not people under the Constitution. Secondly is that for a while they're saying they'd have to have some identification cards to come back, but it's not like they walked out with a passport and a driver's license. I mean, their homes were burned to the ground and everything they had. They left, with the shirt on their backs, if they had a shirt on their backs, and oftentimes not with their children, if their children had, been murdered or wandered off. So it's a little unrealistic to think that this is some sort of economic development. I think sort of even before we get to that, there has to be some recognition that these are people. And we're not even there. And I think the condemnation as genocide is helpful. Obviously, sanctions, as has been suggested, has historically been somewhat helpful. But I think that we're so far off from thinking that they're going back anytime soon.
So I agree with that. I think in order to have a transitional justice mechanism to begin thinking seriously about them, you need to have a real transition. And this is, at best right now, a stalled transition. You have a situation where there really isn't meaningful access to many areas of northern Rakhine State by humanitarian actors, which is controlled, that access is controlled by the Tatmadaw. You don't have a recognition of the catastrophe that's happened on the part of either the civilian or the military leadership. You don't even have a civilian leadership that's willing to call this people by its name. Without these kinds of predicates, thinking about a transitional justice mechanism, which is the kind of mechanism you would put in place when you had a sort of consensus, a political consensus in a country that it was time to take a step forward to a new political moment, we're not there yet. There's too much that needs to be done.
Thank you. Let me ask one final question. Some of our colleagues in the Senate would argue that disciplinary measures against Burma's military might make it harder to transition to democracy and end the civil war. However, the UN fact-finding mission report found that these same military leaders are one of the greatest barriers to democratic reform. So given the political entrenchment of the Burmese military and the constitutional weakness of the civilian government, what can be done by the United States or the international community to encourage the military to get out of politics?
Well, first of all, we thought that lifting the sanctions in about 2012, some of the sanctions would somehow coerce them. It was a recognition of moving towards a democracy. That obviously didn't work. And again, I'm speaking as myself as we can't police the world, and I don't think we can police the world, but we don't have to participate. We don't have to let people participate in the world like the military leaders who are behind this. So I don't know how you get the military to sort of back off. We've tried many things over many decades, but I think letting them participate in the world and not the United States not taking a stronger stand is probably. I think we should take a stronger stand. Now, the reference to the International Tribunal, the International Criminal Court, if that worked, I'd be all for it. But the International Criminal Court has been somewhat feckless historically. The Sudan has had an outstanding genocide indictment against President Bashir of Sudan for, I don't know, what's 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and nothing has been done. So I don't think we can think of the ICC as some answer to all this. I think it really is incumbent upon the United States and Congress to make a decision about what it wants to do, what kind of statement it wants to make. But I think what's been most successful and not particularly successful is when the United States takes a strong stand and doesn't participate with nations that are doing ethnic cleansing or genocide.
So I'll just, a couple of thoughts about this. I think the challenges that all international criminal justice mechanisms face is they don't have enforcement powers of their own. They really need to rely on member states to enforce their warrants and their judgments. So if the international community gets behind an accountability effort, which I think is certainly warranted in this case, it's also going to be important to do the diplomacy that's necessary to mobilize the international community to deliver on judgments that are reached and warrants that are issued. In terms of the question, how to bring the military along on this case, I mean, I tend to agree there's not a magic bullet. I think the impulse is going to have to be driven from internally by a reform effort that, frankly, just is not evident right now. That group or that basis of reformers has not, I think, yet materialized. I think one hopes that the kinds of pressure tools that we've talked about, targeted sanctions, threats of accountability, and the like, can help demonstrate that this is not a satisfactory status quo for anybody involved. And then I think the other piece of this is continued engagement and a conversation with the civilian leadership and, frankly, conversations with the military leadership as well to make the point that if Myanmar wants to progress, if it wants to diversify its ability to engage diplomatically, militarily, with a full range of international actors, then it's going to need to evolve beyond the sort of straitjacket that it's placed itself in at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
And I think Beijing's pressure at the Security Council has been a very real impediment to trying to move the international community on this, given their veto. We go to Eliana Ross-Layton in Florida.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for holding this important hearing. It's great to see you again, Greta. Thank you for everything that you've been doing with your VOA show and shining a light on and your important advocacy on human rights issues on your show every day, every week. And thank you, Mr. Pomper, for being here to testify in front of us. For years now, many of us on this committee have been speaking out in support of the Rohingya people. In 2014, we supported a resolution that this committee passed, Jim McGovern's House Resolution 418, which called for an end to persecution and for the U.S. to take more action on behalf of the Rohingyas. And that, in the years since, members of our committee have sent letters after letters asking for the administration to take more action, urging more pressure on the Burmese government, sanctions against those responsible for this genocide, access for humanitarian assistance. And just last month, we joined a letter by our ranking member Engel urging the administration to levy additional sanctions against Burma's military leadership to make a public determination over this genocide. And this month, we signed on to Jan Cherkowski and ranking member Engel's letter, again expressing concern about the imprisonment of the two Reuters journalists, and the list goes on. And in the wake of the UN report saying that the Burmese military actions meet the legal threshold of genocide, which we've been discussing, it also called for a formal international independent investigation into these crimes. And it's important to note ranking member Engel's Burma Act, which still needs to be passed, and that aims to impose additional sanctions and ensure accountability about the human rights violations in Burma. We had Joe Crowley and Steve Shabbat, who's a wonderful member of our committee, who passed an important bill condemning the ethnic cleansing going on. So many efforts on behalf of members of Congress, and especially of this committee, but we need to start seeing results with real consequences, real deterrence to stop this genocide from happening. And the administration has commendably implemented some necessary sanctions, but it's also important and necessary to ask, was there anything that could have been done differently? When Aung San Suu Kyi returned to Burma's political process in 2011, so many were encouraged by very limited democratic steps. But as I said in 2012, it was far too soon to start easing sanctions, as the last administration was committed to doing, never mind its outright lifting of sanctions in 2016. This is not to say that anyone but the Burmese military is responsible for the genocide, but Greta, I would ask you, was this a case of moving too fast, too soon? Was the easing and lifting of economic pressure and sanctions against Burma's military regime a case of wishful thinking? And how can we make sure we don't make this mistake again?
First of all, 2020 hindsight is far different than reviewing something at the time. At the time that the sanctions are being considered for lifting and that they're actually lifted, I thought it was a good idea. I think we'll try anything, encourage anyone to be a democracy. So I had hoped, and I think everybody else involved with it had hoped that those sanctions would encourage a greater move towards democracy in Myanmar. It has not turned out that way, despite everyone's best effort and the U.S. government's best effort to do that. I think, and you've listed, Congressman, all the many things that Congress has done, the letters, and I tell you, that is, in my personal opinion, those are so well received, and it's so appreciative. I mean, the fact that they're holding the hearings today for these people who are, a bazillion miles away, sitting in horrible, deplorable conditions, and the fact that the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress cares about them, certainly is, should be significant to the American people. It shows about what we are. Frankly, if I have any sort of disappointment, sort of what you've laid out, my disappointment really is in my own business, in the media, is that I think the media has there's a lot to report on in the world. I got that, but I don't think the media has put the spotlight on this story enough so that enough people are informed about it, so the American people can be, participate in this and help, and help as well to give some sort of guidance to their leaders, the members of Congress. It takes 2 seconds to tweet something, and it goes that we all have 1 million followers in the media. So, I thank Congress for what it's doing. I appreciate what the Obama administration tried to do and was ineffective. But we're in a new time and I hope now that there's a bigger spotlight on this, and I hope that that Congress can fashion something, or that my personal opinion is I'd like to tighten the sanctions on those military leaders, because I see that as the problem. Aung San Suu Kyi, we all hoped that she was going to be the answer. But she doesn't have much power as a civilian leader. I think, we sort of almost built up in our own minds that she was going to be able to do these magical things. She won't even mention the word Rohingya. She won't even say that. Maybe she's worried for her life. I don't know what it is, but she won't even say that. But I think we can stop putting our money on her. I don't think that she has the power, or she hasn't indicated the willingness, although I would hope things would change. But I think it's really going to take a collective effort, and I really call out, the media, is that it takes 2 seconds to tweet things and doesn't take a lot to report on this, because we need to give you guys cover the spotlight by informing the American people so people care about
Well,
this.
thank you. My time is up, so now I get to interrupt you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your advocacy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, thank you. We go to David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and the ranking member for calling this hearing, and thank our witnesses. I was on the trip, the fact-finding mission with Senator Durbin and Senator Merkley in November, and I want to begin by saying thank you to Greta Van Susteren for the attention you're bringing to this. I do hope that maybe as a result of this hearing that there will be additional attention from the media, because it was the most haunting trip I have ever made. We had the opportunity to hear directly from members of the Rohingya community in Bangladesh about unspeakable atrocities, and they showed us the burns on their bodies and recounted stories of the slaughter of their children and family members, and it is horrific. And we were, in fact, denied the right to go into the Rakhine State. And as a kind of consolation prize, they took us to Anglar, which is a ghetto in Myanmar, where they've rounded up the Rohingya, taken them away from their homes, and they're forced to live in this ghetto. They ran businesses, had shops nearby. They're not allowed to work in those shops anymore. There's no education, no health care, and they've done nothing at all other than be Rohingya, and they're put into this. And so they were very proud to show us this place as an alternative. We then heard stories from the government that, oh no, the Rohingya burned down their own villages. I mean, it was just horrific. There was no willingness to accept responsibility in any way. So I appreciate the work that you have both done to bring attention to this. My first question is, in terms of an ICC referral, having an international forum where some evidence can be presented so the world can understand what's happening, it seems to me would be very useful. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Pomper, what you think would be the consequence if the United States stood in the way of that. The reason I raise that question is Mr. Bolton has said in a speech that we don't believe in the ICC, we'll never cooperate or assist them in any way. And so in this moment, this becomes particularly important in my view.
So thank you for the question. I mean, I agree generally with the tenor of the observations that have been made today, that the United States by itself is obviously a very powerful voice and a powerful actor and can be a real leader on situations like this, but it's most effective when it also works with multilateral institutions that have, within their remit, addressing these kinds of situations. And in this particular context, two of the leading institutions that have those capabilities and that have that remit are the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court. And those are two institutions that this administration has sort of spared no effort in recent months attacking their legitimacy. And I think that's a terrible mistake. And I think, you saw a little bit of a tacit recognition of that when Ambassador Haley associated herself with the Fact-Finding Commission's findings when she spoke to the Security Council. That fact-finding mission, was mandated and supported by the UN Human Rights Council, and it's an extremely credible commission, and the work that it's done has been absolutely critical in framing international conversation around these atrocities. Why one would delegitimize that is absolutely beyond me. I think as far as the International Criminal Court, I would make a couple of observations. First, the International Criminal Court has actually already seized itself of this matter. It's done so in an incomplete way. There was a judgment by a pretrial chamber of the court recently that asserted jurisdiction over certain crimes that have, as part of their predicate, actions that took place in Bangladesh, which is a state party to the ICC. So it has partial jurisdiction. Obviously, a referral by the Security Council would give it greater jurisdiction and would allow it to do a more complete job in terms of investigating and potentially prosecuting these cases at some point. I think that would be useful, but it's also important to give them the support that they need to do that.
Right. Thank you very much. I think also, one of the principal issues which you both touched upon is the stripping of citizenship. We had the opportunity to meet with members of the National Assembly, their parliament, who were elected and served, and are members of the Rohingya community that have now been stripped of their citizenship. So to say to these folks, you are not citizens of this country when they served in the government, I think shows the absurdity. And I think the question of how do you have a repatriation process that makes sure that the Rohingya can return safely and with full citizenship so that they can return to their country free from intimidation, the fear of death and violence, I think is obviously an important issue. And I know Aung San Suu Kyi, who may not have a lot of power in the current construct, has a lot of moral authority, and she has completely failed in any way to speak out against this violence, to acknowledge it. The fact that she may have less power than the military, it may in fact be true, but she has the power of her voice and her international standing, and she has completely failed in that responsibility, and it's been a grave disappointment to many of us here in Congress. And I know my time has run out, but I thank you again for your thoughts, and yield back.
We go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where does the Burmese military get their weapons and ammunition? What type of weapons and ammunition do they have?
I'll defer to you. Do you know that answer? I don't know where they get it.
I would be speculating, I'm sorry.
You don't, we know they're shooting people, but we haven't.
They use a lot of machetes, they burn, and they rape. So that's
Well,
been there. They've weaponized a lot of things like that, but I don't know about their weapons.
Not from the United States, which has an arms embargo in place.
Right.
Beyond that, I can't say
So
anything.
would I be just really off base if I suggest that it's very possible that the Chinese are providing the Burmese military the weapons they need for these type of actions?
You're free to suggest that. It's certainly not a crazy suggestion.
All right. Well, let me just note that the type of genocide that and brutality and mass killings that the Burmese government has been known for 3 decades now, at least. I mean, I remember being very active when trying to support the Karens and the Karennis and the others. And the Burmese government and their military has not just been focused on the Rohingyas, which we need to worry about today because those are the ones who are bearing the brunt of this brutality and genocide. But this is a history of this type of activity, and we should know where their weapons are coming from. And I would suggest that they're probably coming from China. We should do, and
Mr. Chairman?
we should do something about it. Yes, sir.
The gentleman would yield. Their weapons do principally come from China. One of the oddities is that the other separatist ethnic groups in Burma also are supplied. The Chinese sell them weapons as well. So they sell the weapons to the government in Myanmar, and they sell weapons to different ethnic
So it sounds like
separatist groups.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing, by the way. I appreciate your leadership, as usual, on human rights issues. And let me just note, the chairman and I had a difference of opinion on the title of the Magnitsky Act, but not the substance of the Magnitsky Act. Is this time for us to have sanctions against the specific leaders of the Burmese military?
Yes.
And again, I'm not here representing the Voice of America or the government, but let me answer personally, yes.
All right. So, Mr. Chairman, today I would hope that whatever comes out of this hearing, that we stand together in that we are going to hold the individuals in leadership of the Burmese military responsible, personally responsible, as well as the government itself. And let us declare that the government of Burma is an outlaw among nations, because this is not inconsistent with their behavior over the last 30 years. And the military and we declare that the military is guilty of crimes against humanity. So one of the things now those are things we can recognize now. What I don't understand is, how come we're the ones that are upset? Where are our Saudis and all of these wealthy Muslim countries that have enormous resources available to them? Why are they permitting their fellow Muslims to live in this type of brutality and squalor.
Well, I can't answer for those questions either, but I can tell you that Bangladesh is very upset because this is very difficult for that nation. That's not a rich nation.
That's
they've
right.
got- and this,
Bangladesh has almost no money for helping. We know there are several countries in this world that are Islamic countries that have enormous resources. And are they helping?
I can't answer that. I know that I can tell you that there were some NGOs from different countries, like Doctors Without Borders, but that's France. I mean, but I don't know if any of these other nations. I defer to you, Mr. Palm.
So I can't give you a complete answer, but I recall from actually your reporting that there's a very substantial number of Rohingya refugees living in Saudi Arabia. I also know that the Organization of the Islamic Conference has been very active diplomatically.
I didn't catch that. The Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qatarans, are they kicking in to help the
I don't know how
people?
much money that is flowing from those.
Well, when you see pictures standing in this, the horrible, in the middle of this village with the horrible conditions that you just showed us, it is more than disappointing to think that, okay, we need to be concerned, but what about these filthy rich Muslim countries? They don't allow any Syrian refugees in. They expect Europe to take all of them. They aren't even helping. They are not helping the Rohingyas and other people who are being targets of genocide. Shame on them. Shame on them. And I would hope that, Mr. Chairman, that they're listening right now. But we can't. All we can do with us is we can make our own commitment to having standards. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the leadership in the Magnitsky Act, although I disagree with the title, and other things like this, that you have made sure that we're part of the solution, and as compared to the Saudis and the Chinese. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you. I also believe the Islamic world should be doing more. To just commit diplomatic resources is not the same as hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. It's my understanding that the United States is by far the most generous of all countries in this and many other crises. Many of us supported the efforts of Aung San Suu Kyi. We met with her, we pushed, we adopted sanctions, and it is disillusioning to the entire democracy and human rights movement worldwide. How do I get people involved in the next human rights champion, in the next democracy champion, when we see someone with a lot of influence use that influence to protect the military of Myanmar? Now, in September of 2018, I joined with several of our colleagues on a bipartisan letter urging Secretary Pompeo to press for the release of the 2 Reuters journalists who were sent to prison for 7 years. I'm so troubled that Aung San Suu Kyi has defended the conviction of these journalists. Ms. Van Susteren, you speak as much as anyone for the journalistic community of this country. What should we be doing?
Well, first of all, let me just add to this that I appreciate that letter on behalf of journalists, and I shared disappointment with the U.S. media. Why aren't we hearing about this from my fellow journalists more? You know, the fact, I mean, that would help. This is a partnership. This is not just, you know, the media can't do it alone, Congress can't do it alone, nobody can do all this alone. So I share that sort of disappointment with the journalists. They are not, of course, the only journalists held by, you know, countries in jails across the world. But these 2 journalists, just to fill in the gap, were framed by the police. They were given some documents and in a restaurant, and as soon as they walked outside the restaurant, they were arrested for having the documents. So, you know, it's terrible. Aung San Suu Kyi, you know, a huge disappointment. Maybe we expected way too much of her, but as sort of we can all sort of look back and think, you know, what could she have done? I think it really sort of behooves us to sort of, in this crisis, as we look at what's happening to the people now, is to figure out what can we do for them. Look, the people in this camp, they're just they're penned in. They can't leave. They can't go to school. They can't do anything. And so, you know, it's a breeding ground for all sorts of diseases and for trouble. And it's for trouble, which is one of the reasons why the director of Voice America wants to get news into the camp so that people see that there's opportunity outside the camp and that at least there are people paying attention.
The purpose of the Burmese military, the Myanmar military, is to ethnically cleanse the area, to reverse what they think is the wrongful act of people moving into their country 100 or 1,000 years ago. Most Americans have moved, families have moved into this country in the last 100 or at least the last 1,000 years. And so we can hope that there are well-maintained refugee camps in Bangladesh, but that achieves the purpose of what seems to be a genocide and a crime against humanity. I'd point out that when the government of Sudan waged war against its own people in the south, we saw an independent South Sudan. Now, things didn't work out recently. Mr. Pomper, if North Rakhine State was either independent or part of Bangladesh, would its people be safe on their own land? Because we know they can be more or less safe in refugee camps, but then they have nothing. They have limited opportunities.
So, forgive me, sir. I'm going to resist the logic of the question a little bit for the very reason that you said, which is that I think these kinds of separationist solutions, unfortunately, honor the logic of ethnic cleansing. And I think at this point, the best way to think about this is in terms of trying to affect a situation where it is actually possible for the Rohingya to come back.
You really think that that the Rohingya could move back and wouldn't be killed 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I don't really think that they can live in peace and security and confidence in a land controlled by the Burmese military.
So let me answer the question in two parts. I think, first, if the government succeeds or the Tatmadaw succeeds in this campaign, what is to stop it from then moving down the list of ethnicities with which it has similar groups?
Well, if it grants independence to each of those ethnicities, so that's exactly what they don't want to do. If the Burmese state loses North Rakhine as part of its sovereign territory, it's not going to want to repeat that elsewhere.
So I would worry about the precedential value inside Myanmar, and I'd worry about the precedential value outside Myanmar as well. I think, in general, the best solution under these circumstances, and I agree, it's difficult to look into the future and say 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, we will certainly be in a situation where we know that this will be solved in terms of creating the circumstances for repatriation, but that needs to remain the objective at this point. In the meantime—
Well, I think we are in favor of repatriation. What the question is, are we in favor of the Burmese military having sovereignty over the repatriated individuals?
So the Burmese military should not have sovereignty over anybody.
The Burmese military can operate in the territory of Burma or Myanmar, and as long as that asking the people to go back and say, that's the army of the country I will live in, and I hope they don't rape my wife and slaughter my children, but that's why I moved back.
So I think you put your finger on it when you refer to
safety requires a government that is dedicated to your safety rather than dedicated to your extermination.
Correct, and it also requires civilian control over a military that
with the civilian control is also in favor or defending what's going on. I yield back.
Steve Chabot of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this very important hearing. In the past month, 2 reports were published detailing how horrific the crimes actually were that we're discussing here today. First, at the end of August, the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar released a preliminary report that argued that the Burmese military had genocidal intent against the Rohingya and called for a competent international authority to try cases against individuals responsible. The final report, issued just last week, makes the case even clearer. And in a hearing like this, it's really hard for any of us to comprehend the horrors that happened to the Rohingya during that period of time, what they endured. These were human beings that endured some of the most horrific things that's possible in human existence. And I would ask that unanimous consent that the full UN report, which I have here, be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And this report contains in great detail those horrors, which again, in a civilized hearing like this, it's hard to speak about those things. The second report from the State Department was released 2 days ago on Monday evening. This spring, the State Department commissioned a survey of Rohingya survivors in Bangladesh to gather from eyewitnesses, and Monday's report discusses their stories. And the report calls the violence extreme, large-scale, and widespread, and states that, quote, the scope and scale of the military's operations indicate that they were well-planned and coordinated, unquote. Of the roughly 1,000 Rohingya refugees interviewed, the vast majority, about 80%, witnessed killings and the destruction of villages. So these are people that actually saw other people murdered. And probably most of the people, hopefully, in this room haven't experienced that in their life, but we're talking about 80% of those people actually saw one or more people slaughtered. In total, we know that 400 villages were burned. Further, about half of those surveys actually witnessed a rape. Statistics really can't tell, they only tell part of the story. The true perversity of these atrocities is clear from the types of crimes the military committed: widespread gang rape, mass murders, throwing infants and children literally into fires, and burning the elderly in their own homes. The report describes in gruesome detail various crimes, and I can't read this stuff. It's so horrific, and I'm not going to. But we're talking about pregnant women who were literally murdered and their unborn children destroyed, in front of them. And it was mentioned, the babies thrown into rivers and their mothers shot. I mean, there's no way in the 21st century this ought to happen anywhere. And I want to thank Mr. Pomper and Ms. Van Susteren for coming here today and sharing this with us and trying to make sure that the world knows what happened and that there's accountability here. This havoc occurred against a group of people, but there was another group of people that did it, and they still exist, and they're still in power. And something has to be done about this, or it will happen again. So with the facts and the reports that I mentioned in mine, I, along with a number of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, plan to introduce a resolution condemning the Burmese government's crimes and their efforts to suppress information about those crimes, and to call it what it is, what it was, and that's genocide. Words are not enough, however, which is why I also urge the swift passage of the Burma Act, legislation that Ranking Member Engel and I wrote to apply sanctions on those individuals responsible for these horrific crimes. As I say, these perpetrators must be held accountable. Mr. Pomper, let me ask you about that. As I mentioned, Mr. Engel and I introduced the Burma Act to impose sanctions on those responsible for the genocide. You mentioned sanctions in your testimony. Is that appropriate? Is that one of the tools that we should at least consider? What would be your opinion on that?
Yes, targeted sanctions are an appropriate tool. They send an important signal, and they should be applied against the perpetrators.
Okay, Ms. Van Susteren, let me ask you this, and I'm running out of time. I'm co-chairman of the House Freedom of the Press Caucus, and concerned about the two Reuters journalists imprisoned in Burma. Earlier this month, many of us on this committee sent a letter to Secretary Pompeo asking that he continue to advocate for their release. And as a journalist yourself, I'd like to hear your perspective on that case and whether you think that international pressure could be effective in securing their release, and what, if anything else, ought to be done to secure that release?
I think that the pressure of that would help enormously for these reporters. You know, when I went deep into these refugee camps, not obviously you're talking about into Myanmar where they're held, is that the refugees were aware of things that were being done inside the United States. So the word does get out. It's it's far away, but that does send some sort of hope that somebody cares. You know, you went through the litany of things that that you've read about. When I've been there and these people tell me these things that happen, you just stand there sort of, it's just thoughtless. You can't imagine these things can happen to human beings. So it's it's just incredible. But the reporters trying to report it can't even get to them inside Rakhine. And there's no way that we're going to get this word out if they can't get there. And if Myanmar is going to lock the journalists up who try, few journalists are going to risk their lives. One of the journalists you talk about, one of the Reuters reporters, I think his wife had a baby while he's been locked up. So and he's got 7 years before he'll live in a home with his child. So I think that pressure from the United States, it does mean something. I mean, people look up to the United States and our freedom of the press and the Constitution, and we're quite proud of it, and it's very important to our government. And I think that if the United States puts pressure on it, I think it will help them. I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but it certainly does send a message.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guests that are here today. It is incredibly offensive to humanity, the crimes that we are seeing that are coming out of this place. It is unfortunate, I think, that the military has been empowered and continues to be armed, by China to commit these horrible crimes. I don't think that we truly understand how many women and how many children have been born out of rape. And I don't know if we'll ever truly understand the fact that we can't get into Burma to assess the situation as reporters. It is incredibly disappointing and unfortunate. But more disappointing than that, as the world, as a community and world leaders have stood by, and I think, where is the responsibility? Where does China stand on this? Are they just being complicit by supplying the weapons that are going into to the military? Mr. Rodebacker asked that question earlier about the Chinese weapons that are being used by the Burmese military. So how would you characterize China's involvement in Burma? And if China wanted, could it force the Burmese military to change its policy?
In terms of China arming them, I'm just learning that here. I didn't know that, but a lot of the destruction I saw didn't take any weapons. It took a match, it took a machete, and it took raping women and putting fear. So a lot of that, the question is whether China would show any sort of moral leadership to try to encourage the Myanmar military to stop doing those things.
With a 1,500-mile border, you would think that they would show some leadership.
Yes, if they bothered to even recognize these people as human. They're
Which
not,
was exactly my point as I began.
I mean, they are not recognizing them as human, and to the extent that they continued to be corralled without any chance at education, they can't work, they can't do anything. The women, by the way, you talk about the women, I met women that were pregnant there. I was there about 9 months after a lot of them had left who were pregnant, is that they didn't know if their babies were their husbands or whether it was the Myanmar military, but it didn't matter because they were said to have evil in their bellies and they were shunned. And the women, are sitting in these huts in this god-awful weather, monsoon, where it's about 100 degrees out, we can't stand it, and they don't even come out. I mean, it gets far more graphic and terrible than we can ever put on the screen or put in a report. I mean, it's just incredible, and I so much appreciate the delegation that has come from Capitol Hill to go there and see some of the stuff, because it really does bring it home when you see it. That's why I love Codels.
I'm going to make one more point. I think that we can all agree that Aung San Suu Kyi has failed to stand up against the Burmese military. She's failed to stand up for these children. She's failed to stand up for these women, and she's failed to stand up for basic human rights. But yet I know that the Nobel Committee does not generally revoke Nobel Prizes. But should they make an exception for her, given the gravity of what has taken place in Burma?
Well, I don't speak for the Nobel, I don't speak for them, and I don't know. So I'm going to duck that question. I just know that she is not, she won't even say the word Rohingya, and that she identifies about 26 terrorists of ARSA, the terrorist group of Rohingya, and she is content to have 1 million people essentially persecuted for the conduct of a few.
We're talking about American focus on this atrocity that is happening there. Where is the international community? Something as simple as this, to send a clear message that as human beings, we're not going to tolerate this. It is, to me, just they are being complicit to what is happening there.
So, and I'll link that comment back to your questions about China. I mean, one place where China has been, unfortunately, very effective in a negative way has been in terms of blocking a clear statement by the UN Security Council.
Absolutely.
And that would be very, the things that the Council could do, the tools that it could bring to bear probably could be pretty effective in sending a clear signal and applying meaningful pressure through sanctions, through referrals, et cetera. And so I think China is a very, very good target for diplomatic suasion in this case, because they are standing in the way of meaningful action and that clear voice you're talking about.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for.
Thank you, Congresswoman Torres. Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Van Susteren, Mr. Pomper, thanks for being here. We met a year ago tomorrow on this very subject and lamented the circumstance where we sit here comfortably and these people are being slaughtered halfway around the world, and we have conversations, but there's no action, and that's the frustration of this place. There is no action, but the United States and the world can't turn their face away from what is happening. 70 years ago, this happened halfway around the world, and people were shoved into ghettos and exterminated, and now we see it happening in Burma and across the little portion of water there where they're all housed and corralled in. And I applaud you, Ms. Van Susteren, as a member of the press. 80 years ago, a man won a Pulitzer Prize for lying about the terror famine executed by Russia in Ukraine, and that Pulitzer Prize still hangs today in the New York Times office, as far as I know. So it's important that we see, that we hear, that we're made aware of what's happening. I remain frustrated because I don't see any action. The UN is not going to be, unless Mr. Pomper, and I doubt, Ms. Van Susteren, it's not your expertise, but Mr. Pomper, I doubt you can tell me that the UN with China and Russia involved are going to support the United States or any of the freedom-loving countries of the world in robust, meaningful action against the Burmese military, right? They're not going to do anything. The UN is going to be feckless.
Things do not look good at the Security Council.
They don't.
Yeah, the Human Rights Council might be a different story.
Yeah, that's a larger discussion, but I guess for you, I have a question. China is, they're, in my opinion, enabling this, whether it's arms or whether it's their agreement with Burma and the port. And, while the president is offering trade, tariffs on China regarding their malign behavior around the world, and particularly the United States, is it time to sanction China? Is it time to sanction, use the word sanction China for this action? Will it make a difference? Ms. Van Susteren, the voice of America, you're saying we want to get that information into the camps. We want to inform them that people around the world, people in the United States care. We want something done about it. We understand their plight. We are horrified by their situation. Is there something impeding that effort?
Well, First of all, I got to tell you, the director of the Voice America, Amanda Bennett, who was first approached me about, telling me that she wanted to get information into it, and it reminded me a little bit sort of the mission of Voice America with the Iron Curtain, was to get information behind the Iron Curtain. When I went into the camps, I was surprised, at how hungry they were for information. The refugees inside, they were getting little bits and pieces, and I don't know what tools or what's needed by Voice America or what they need. I don't know that. I'm not privy to that. It's above my volunteer job pay grade. But I do know that if we can get more information into the refugee camp, if we can get broadband in, or if you can get radios in and they can hear a little more, that certainly would benefit the people inside, because they are completely lost. I mean, even hearing that the United States has a congressional hearing at least gives them a little hope that somebody cares, halfway around the globe. And I think, I think I always think putting a spotlight on the crisis, if the American media were more engaged in this, I think more people, maybe China, would pay a little more attention to it. I don't know. I think that's important. But I do think getting Voice America inside that camp and getting information would help.
Okay, so that's a due out for us here on this committee and in this body to do a better job and to find out what the hang-up is and what the hold-up is and what the obstruction is, and
that hang-up may be on the ground, though. It may not have anything to do with the United States or Voice America. I don't know. That's above my pay grade.
I understand, but we got to understand that and try and figure. We want to be people of action. We want to see some results, right? The talk is cheap, but people are suffering. Mr. Pomper, China.
So I think I agree with what Greta said about trying to raise the profile of this issue. I think the U.S. government could be speaking with a much clearer voice. I think there was a lot of value in the report that the State Department put out earlier this week, but it was a little bit of a missed opportunity in terms of using specific terms about their legal conclusions, which I think they pretty clearly had reached. That's just my supposition based on reading it. I think it's important to pressure China through diplomatic channels by making clear that we see what's going on, that we've analyzed it, we associate ourselves with the good work that's done by international bodies on this.
With all due respect, Mr. Pomper, everybody knows. Like China knows that these Burmese people, these military officers that have been designated as specially designated nationals and blocked persons and put on that list, they don't care. If you're willing to hack somebody apart with a machete, I don't think you're worried about being put on a list as a designated bad person. So while the diplomatic look, we wish that would always be effective. What we're looking for is something to be effective, and from my standpoint, I don't see the diplomacy. I don't see China buckling under the withering diplomacy from the United States. It seems to me that action regarding their significant investment in that port is something that they might buckle to.
Yeah. It's hard to make great powers buckle, and so I'm hesitant to sort of suggest coercive measures there, but I will say I do agree that they should I understand your point about not caring. I think there is a great callousness, I think, towards the suffering, and I don't want to defend them in any way. But I do think that continuing to raise the pressure, speaking with a clearer voice, can create greater costs for people who take that posture.
We go to Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. And I was glad to see yesterday the announcement about the United States committing another $185 million to help combat this humanitarian tragedy. Let me ask you about, because I'm co-chair of the U.S.-ASEAN caucus, about the involvement of the ASEAN nations or any effort that they've made to help in this situation that you all may be aware of.
I'm not personally aware, but with 1 million people on the ground, there are almost 1 million people. There are NGOs from literally, every place. I mean, I was obviously privy mostly to the American ones, the Samaritan's Purse, of course. There's other ones too. Doctors Without Borders are doing incredible. But you hear stories about how everyone's so proud that they've vaccinated 400,000 people from cholera. What the problem is, when they told me that and they were all excited, I'm doing the math and I think, well, what about the other 400,000? So a lot more help is needed.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I'm not sort of on top of the specifics of the ASEAN response. I think, but I do associate myself with Greta's comments that more is always needed, and particularly if we're talking about multilateral responses, getting the region on board with whatever the United States has in mind in terms of coercive measures, if there's going to be some sort of international criminal justice proceeding that might result in arrest warrants at some point, getting the region on the same page so that those will actually be meaningfully enforced is incredibly important.
No, thank you. I yield back.
All right, we go now to Dan Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you both for the insight, and you described this atrocity tremendously in your video, Greta. It was, if not eye-opening, stomach-sickening because of what's happening to these people. I just wanted to ask two different areas. One about helping these poor people. Is there a struggle getting resources? Is someone trying to block our abilities to assist the people who are now refugees, or is it a matter of just getting more help and relief to them?
Well, I mean, they always need more medicine. When I was there, they needed more medicine. They were out of medicine. There's always a food shortage. So yes, they can always use more. One of the other sort of practical problems is that to get there, I mean, from Cox's Bazar, which is the city that where you'd probably start positioning things, is that it's the worst roads you can imagine, the worst traffic you can imagine. I mean, it's really sort of hard to get the trucks through when you even within the camps themselves. When I was there, is that we went into the camp and an hour later that the bridge, the mud bridge that got us into the camp had washed away from the monsoons, and there was an ambulance that couldn't get across the mud bridge because it had washed out. So I mean, it's all sorts of problems like that any sort of giant catastrophe has. The good news is all these organizations that are on the ground, they are so well coordinated because they have responded to every single crisis you can imagine, whether it's an earthquake in Haiti or it's a refugee camp in Sudan. They all sort of know each other and work well together, and the UN. It is really, it appeared to be really well organized. The problem is it's the magnitude of the problem, and you've got the weather, which is so punishing. The monsoon it's indescribable.
But the local government services, and they're not preventing us from getting
I don't think they are, but the local people are starting to get upset, much like you see with the Syrian refugees going into Jordan. When people do sort of slip out and then they start taking the jobs, then the local people start to get upset. And you've got the other problem is that it was a beautiful, lush area, and the Rohingya have come in and they've cut down every single piece of foliage there so they could build huts and so that they have fuel. There's nothing there, which of course then contributes to the whole problem with the mudslides when the monsoon comes. So naturally this is such a burden on Bangladesh. Bangladesh has been, I scan the newspapers when I'm here, has been relatively quiet in terms of the media about complaining about it. I think they've been quite generous, but this is a huge burden on a very poor country, and at some point this is they're going to break.
Mr. Pompa, you spoke earlier about our message, the United States message about the crisis not being clear. What should we be doing?
So I just what I meant by that was when the State Department issued its report, it sort of went up to a point in terms of the conclusions that it reached, but it did not actually crystallize those conclusions around the kinds of provisional legal conclusions that people were expecting the report to articulate. It also wasn't rolled out in a very clear way. It wasn't accompanied by any kind of policy vision. Normally, when you do an exercise like that, I think the hope is that while you're doing it, you're also thinking about what you're going to say about where policy is supposed to go and how it's going to create sort of a meaningful context into which this kind of this work can land. And I think that work still needs to be done.
But it didn't indicate that our commitment is wavering at all, did it?
I just think it was a little bit of a missed opportunity.
Okay. And my last question in my last minute is about, a lot of my colleagues spoke about China's ability, if they wanted to influence the atrocities that are happening and help us to stop the genocide that's occurring. Are they the only other country? Are there other people who have influence in the region that could be helpful to us?
So the entire, the entire region is going to be important to any kind of response that the United States wants to, help to craft and to lead. The Chinese are by far the most important because of their veto power at the Security Council and because of the importance of the Security Council to creating a legal framework for collective action.
Back in New York, we would say, who else could we put the arm on?
I think I would be very liberal in terms of outreach at this point because the entire region is going to be important to the response.
Okay. I thank you both.
Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank our two distinguished witnesses for your leadership and as well as for your testimony today. It's very challenging, and certainly you put a very important bit of emphasis on the need for significant action. We're nowhere near doing what we could or should be doing. You mentioned the ICC, and I think, the ICC has had 2 convictions since its founding, at least according to up to 2016. I've met with Bashir in Khartoum. He still has that, what should be a sort of Damocles being held over his head, and yet he travels the world. He goes to China, and they don't grab him and send him to The Hague for prosecution. So it has been feckless, but I would hope that there would be a referral by the Security Council. China will likely veto that, but we ought to, I think, pursue that. So thank you for that. Let me just ask, and maybe you might want to comment on that. You know, I was the House sponsor of the Global Magnitsky Act, pushed very hard. We got it into the NDAA. It is an excellent law, and it makes a difference. Now, since 2017, General Meng So was sanctioned. In August of 2018, 3 more military and 1 police sanctioned, the 33rd Light Infantry, the 99th Light Infantry. The question would be, first question, is that enough, or should more be listed on that sanctions list? Secondly, in 2013, one of my staffers interviewed the infamous Buddhist monk Weiratu, who called himself the Buddhist bin Laden. And he instigated, as we know, much of the violence targeting the Rohingya. He concluded, and this goes to your point, Mr. Pomper, about the list of ethnicities that could still be targeted, and we know the Christians were targeted before. I remember when we called this junta the Slork, and they continue to be as bad as they have ever been, if not worse, with this genocide against the Rohingya. But he said, and this is his words to a member of my staff, first the Muslims, then the Christians, both are threats to our Buddhist future. And has been said by my colleagues, we've all been disappointed in Aung San Suu Kyi and others, but it seems to me that they're not going to stop with the Muslims. And of course, there's already killings of Christians, but you might want to speak to that as well. Let me also ask you about, and some of my colleagues have referenced it, but China's goal is to make the world safe for dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. They certainly want a warm water port on the Bay of Bengal. And you got a situation, as we all know, where they are not only providing weapons, but they're simpatico. They are in solidarity with the atrocities being committed by this regime. We need to put more pressure on China, and you might want to speak to that. Are we raising it sufficiently with Xi Jinping or not? And if you could speak to that as well. And finally, on trafficking, I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We have another bill pending today, this hour, over on the Senate side. Hopefully, if it does, it'll be my 5th law on combating human trafficking, if they pass it. The question is, what is your sense of what's happening? And you've been to the camps. Greta, thank you for your leadership on that. What's the deal with the trafficking? Do you have any insights you could provide us?
First, I can tell you about the trafficking. We never
Yes,
even got to that. That's just a growing crisis in there because you've got a lot of young girls in there, and what happens, the brokers come in, and that's a huge problem, and it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better because what happens is, at least I talked to someone who was working on the camps and trying to combat it, is that the brokers come in and they say to these families, look, send your 13-year-old girl with me. I'll take her to beauty school in Saudi Arabia or China or something, and she'll send all this money back. So trafficking, we haven't even touched that. That's a problem. It's a bad problem now. It's not going to get better. So that you can put that one on your list. The question about the Christians, the attention, of course, is on the Rohingya, the Muslims, but information that I'm told is that the Christians, the Koreans, they're also getting persecuted, just not at the numbers, but they're not getting the media attention either. So we don't know much about that, and of course, they don't have the magnitude of the Rohingya. The ICC, I don't have a lot of hope in the ICC, but I definitely think we should do everything we can to use every tool in your toolbox. And to the extent that we get the ICC interested in this, I think that's good. It puts attention on it. And you mentioned China protecting Bashir. Well, it's not even just China. Even South Africa, then President Zuma helped Bashir sneak out of South Africa, and they're a signatory to the ICC. So the ICC is not going to answer this, but it's going to put more world pressure. It's sort of collective. It's why we need Congress, we need the UN. We need the ICC and all those things. Sanctions, and I say this personally, is if we can put more sanctions on more people, put a squeeze on more people.
So I think I agree with all that. I think starting with the ICC, yes, it's an imperfect institution with a track record that's a little bit better than than it was a few years ago, but still, it's suffered to be effective. And I think, as I mentioned earlier in this hearing, one of the issues is that, the international community needs to support its effort. It doesn't have a police force. It doesn't have an enforcement arm. It relies on member states. It relies on the international community to support it. So that's where U.S. diplomacy can actually be helpful. Right now, U.S. diplomacy is committed to actually undermining the court and its legitimacy, so it's going in the wrong direction. In a perfect world, the U.S. government would actually be supplying information and actually helping them build the case, which they've already sort of started to build. They've launched a preliminary examination. They've seized themselves of jurisdiction. There is an opportunity there. Unfortunately, I think we're missing that opportunity. On targeted sanctions, the fact-finding mission, I think, listed a number of potential targets who have not yet been designated by the United States. I would hope that the State Department and the Treasury Department would be looking into those targets. On the other ethnic minorities, yes, the Shan and the Kachin were both, I think, subjects a little bit of the fact-finding mission report. There's a lot that should be explored there. It would be great if Congress could bring attention to those plights as well. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to go to Sandy Levin of Michigan and then Mike McCall of Texas.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the committee letting me join in. I don't know, is it appropriate for me to enter a statement in the record? Is that appropriate?
Without objection.
So let me just say a very few things. I think I wanted to come here to congratulate the committee on paying attention to this serious issue and to your testimony. I think the evidence is totally clear. I think genocide has occurred. There's been some hesitation to say that, and that is recent with the State Department report, where they spelled it out so clearly as was spelled out in the UN report. But they hesitate to call it genocide when it is. Secondly, I think there's been hesitation because of the role of Aung San Suu Kyi. And I understand that, and others who have met her can understand that. She was a champion. The problem is that the events there have, I'm afraid, caused her to pull back. And it's had a dramatic effect, I think, throughout. And you mentioned the failure of the media here to really bear down. And I think at times there was some hesitation within this Congress. I think it was a year and a half or more ago that the late John McCain and Dick Durbin introduced a resolution in the Senate that said it very clearly, and I essentially took that resolution and I introduced it in the House. And again, I think because of Aung San Suu Kyi, there was some hesitation. But I recently read a comment of hers, it's one of many, and this is what she said about the treatment of the Rohingya. There are, of course, ways in which hindsight, I think, with hindsight, I think, the situation could have been handled better. We believe for the sake of long-term stability and security, we have to be fair to all sides. When it comes to this circumstance, to genocide, there really is only one side. And I want to close, Mr. Chairman and others, by remembering a time, it was a couple decades ago, and President Clinton was there with Elie Wiesel. It was on a different subject. And Elie Wiesel turned to the President of the United States and said, "Don't forget the Bosnian genocide. And so I want to close, Mr. Chairman, again saying the work of this committee is so important. And while it's too late, I think before we recess Friday, it's my hope that in addition to what has been done by this committee and the Congress so far, that when we come back, there will be further steps taken.
Thank you, Mr. Levin.
So let me thank you again for this opportunity, and I want, with so many others, to join you in taking the further steps necessary to bring to the attention of the world and everybody in this country, including the release of those two reporters, the need for still further action. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. And I also want to thank Tom Garrett here with us. Tom was here since before 10 o'clock this morning. And without objection, I'd like to go to Mr. Garrett for his questioning now, if we could.
Thank you a lot, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate this hearing, and I appreciate the work of the Voice of America, let alone Mr. Van Sesteren. The Voice of America, when properly levied, has been instrumental to the freedom of literally hundreds of millions of people, and that shouldn't be underestimated. But not properly levied, we probably are pouring bad money after good. But in this circumstance, we're on the right side of history. As it relates to the points made by Mr. Pomper, I find both agreement and disagreement. And Ms. Van Sesteren said earlier, Mr. Chair, that we should use all of the above. I wholeheartedly agree. Having said that, the questions as it relates to the UN Human Rights Commission, et cetera, exacerbate some of us because, candidly, those bodies have been used to stymie progress in the right direction, right? I mean, when you have a body wherein there are members like the DRC, Angola, Pakistan, who horribly exploits ethnic minorities, China, who has imprisoned north of 1 million Uyghur and oppressed that population, Saudi Arabia, who I need not speak to, and Cuba, who maimed members of the U.S. State Department staff on the UN HRC, maybe their credibility is in question. Having said that, work with the tools you have, not the tools you wish you had. Refugee camps breed hopelessness, hopelessness breeds extremism, and extremism stymies the most fundamental of human rights, that being paramount, the right to life, amongst others. I spent 8 months in a tent standing between Bosnian Serbs and Muslims in the Army when I was younger, better looking, and had more hair. And I think it's been poignant that some members of this committee, Mr. Chair, have pointed out the role of China in these egregious circumstances. There is a role of China, some of which I can't speak about in this forum. How dare China wag its finger at us when they continue to perpetrate this aforementioned violations against the Uyghurs, against the Falun Gong, against those who would practice the Christian faith. And yet we need to understand how China works. China drives wedges between potential alliances. There's probably no more important region in the next 30 years of our world than ASEAN. And Burma maintains Myanmar maintains the second largest standing army in that region after Vietnam. They are wholly dependent upon the Chinese. And the Chinese have interest, again, that I can't discuss in this forum, in some of the atrocities that have been perpetrated. We need to speak the truth to that. I understand, as Mr. Pomper said, and I'll paraphrase, that sometimes it's hard to move a great power. You will not accomplish anything you do not try to do. So we need to try. Understanding the Chinese drive wedges between potential alliances, use proxies to advance Chinese interests, create regional vacuums that the Chinese can fill, and then lie, lie, lie. That's the China paradigm. So what can we do here today? And this is a passion of mine. I've had the opportunity to work with Americans, both Muslim and non-Muslim, in groups like our AIM to send aid to the Rohingya, building wells, building houses, building bridges. Because when children can't get across a raging torrent during a monsoon, then you have a secondary child separation. But we need to worry about what we can do, and we need to understand where we come from. We have Dred Scott. We had Jim Crow. We had the first Article 1 with 3/5 of a person. We've improved because the preamble calls for forming a more perfect union, not establishing a perfect one. We should demand the same of those with whom we work. Global Magnitsky, it's been hit on. I have to tip my hat repeatedly to Chairman Royce, to Chris Smith, to members across the aisle. We should walk this dog all the way to the end of the line and pound everybody we can. We can do that unilaterally, and we should. And I've heard, and in fact, I've called for in this committee the revocation of Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel Peace Prize, but we can't control that. What we can control is the Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded to Aung San Suu Kyi in 2008 and then given to her in person in this town 400 yards from where we sit by this body. It is the highest honor bestowed by Congress and has been enjoyed by Pope John Paul, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Ronald Reagan, Raoul Wallenberg, who saved tens of thousands, Mother Teresa and the Dalai Lama, and Aung San Suu Kyi. So we can't control the Nobel Prize, but we can send a pretty loud signal. Now, I understand that there are complexities here, that Ms. Suu Kyi's hands at some level are tied, but silence at some point is complicity. And the words that she has spoken about democracy and freedom for individuals across communities ring hollow in light of her current inaction in the face of a massive, massive displacement and murder and rape and enslavement of human beings in her nation. So these are things we can do now. We need to ramp up Global Magnitsky. It is an amazing tool, and this body bestowed upon her an award enjoyed by the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa. We should see immediately about revoking that, because that we can control. I'd yield back, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett, thank you. We go now to Mike McCall, Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Ms. Van Susteren, thanks for putting a media spotlight on this, and I agree with you. The media should call more attention. We did that in Sudan and exposed the genocide happening there. I think it's happening here, in this case, in Burma. It is a crime against humanity, and what I worry about is the role of China, because we know that they are providing the Burmese military, they're basically arming them with major arms suppliers. They are trying to invest in Burma under the One Belt, One Road initiative, where we've seen time and time again, they go into countries, leverage them, and then take over their ports, like in Sri Lanka, like in Djibouti. Here, they have the Indian Ocean ports in Burma. So we know they're trying to, that's their strategy going in. And so the question is diplomacy, sanctions. I know some in the Senate think we need more diplomacy. It's not time for sanctions, but what, the two of you, what are your thoughts on sanctioning the military, the Burmese military? And if so, what impact would that have on the Burmese government to possibly turn to China for more investment?
Well, first of all, let me speak personally, not on behalf of the Voice of America. I keep saying this like a broken record, but just so that everyone is clear. Look, I'm all for whatever, as I said, every tool we have is to use it, and to increase the sanctions, I think, is particularly good. When you say what is going to happen if we do that with Burma, well, we've seen with the trade war that we have with the tariffs, with the soybeans, is that China just went someplace else. They just went, they're getting it from Brazil, and they're getting it from some other nation. So, you know, there's always a problem when you put in sanctions that they just look for another market, and they get the market. Nonetheless, do we want to, as a nation, do we want to stand up to this? That's really sort of the issue, and that's really your decision, you know, as representatives, and not mine. But there's no question that if you put in sanctions, oftentimes they just go someplace else.
Right. So I think, you know, where I've been on this is that targeted sanctions against perpetrators of these atrocities is an appropriate consequence, and it sends the right message, and it's something that the United States should pursue. It's important as much as anything as a signal to future perpetrators, both in Myanmar and elsewhere, and making it clear that the United States and others who hopefully it can bring along in this effort, you know, will not let these kinds of crimes go unanswered.
Well, and I tend to agree. I think we have a moral obligation here to do something. And I think Congress has that authority, that we can issue sanctions. The United Nations, International Criminal Court, you know, they've been called upon to prosecute this. I think I agree with you, Ms. Van Susteren. They have been a bit feckless, powerless. They can't go into these countries. And you and I were prosecutors, and it's hard for them to adequately prosecute. They don't have access to the witnesses. And so, yeah, and the UN has its problems. But that's one thing I think Congress can do here is issue sanctions against the Burmese military. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Ted Yoho, Chairman of our Asia Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for having the endurance to stay here.
Ms. Van Susteren, when you started off, you said journalists must document atrocities, and I agree with that. Because that's the only way that message gets out. But and I think you followed up. I agree, and we say never again. We must mean it. So the question always comes out: how, who, and when. And just as we've heard over and over again, the history. When Nazi Germany went in and they were going through Europe, collecting, rounding up, separating, processing, and murdering the Jews, the world stood by. I don't think purposely it was happening while Hitler was taking over Europe and conquering countries. It was the aftermath of that, and we all remember, I guess us older ones remember, when General Eisenhower stated never again when they went to Auschwitz, and they saw these camps that exposed that to the world. That was the journalists, and I commend you for what you're doing. And so we've said never again, yet here we are saying never again. And all we have to do is look back in the last 20 or 30 years. We see Darfur, Mao Zedong murdered 80 million people in his own country. Darfur, Sudan, Kosovo, Bosnia, Syria, Yemen, now the Rohingya. Never again. Like you said, when do we mean that? So the questions that come up: who should be the policing force? Is it one country? Can the U.S. do that by itself? I would think not. How do you do that? And we've heard sanctions. We do sanctions all the time. And yes, they have some effect, but as Chairman McCall brought out, we can sanction, but China comes in, another country comes in. And it's the same thing we're going through with the DPRK. We put sanctions on there, but if another country cheats, so there's got to be a better enforcing body that we together collectively as nations agree this will be the body that goes in there. And you can do isolation, you can isolate a country, you can put embargoes, and then of course the last one is the kinetic actions. In your opinions and your experience, both of you, if you could write policy and direct and say, if you guys would do this, we could have this outcome, how would you like to see it? Because I know you're on the ground all the time and you see it, and you'll probably see some things that are just obvious.
Well, first of all, we can't police the world. I mean, you listed a couple places. I mean, there are other places even that aren't on your list, like the Nuba Mountains in Sudan that nobody's paying attention to. Sure. I mean, it's just impossible to think of us as policing it. In terms of, I think for me at least, as an American, I at least want to stand up to this and say, we know about this, and we're not going to be part of it. We're not going to do business with you. We're going to sanction you. And just from a moral standpoint, is that we're going to do everything we can not to let you, meaning Myanmar, to participate in the rest of the world. I think that's the best we can do. We can't, look, we don't have we can't solve all these problems. No, I mean, it's unrealistic. But at least we can have the confidence that at least we're trying to do something and we're making a statement about where we are on these human rights things. And the other problem, too, is that, quite frankly, the more practical thing is that these refugee camps are breeding camps for some very bad things.
As we
Eventually,
know.
The women go off to the trafficking, the men go off to the fishing boats, and then we have extremist group it's a fertile breeding ground because they've got nothing to do all day long. They even, if they're lucky, if they get food that they need or medicine that they need, to see their kids die, their babies die because Doctors Without Borders might not have enough medicine. I mean, when I was there, stories. I mean, you wouldn't believe what these doctors are trying to do. I mean, we can put people on ventilators here. What they have to do, they have to take a bladder and just pump it all night long. Pump it if they've got a dying child. Well, that makes some very unhappy situation inside the camp. So, look, we can't. I don't think we can solve this, but at least we can have moral authority in the world, and we can say we're not doing business with you, and we're going to sanction you. But that's you're asking me what my wish list is it's in light of being very practical that we can't solve all these problems, but we can at least stand up to them.
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do is expose it, and I commend both of you for doing that. Mr. Pomper, you got any ideas or thoughts of what you would recommend?
So I agree that there are limits to American influence. I think American influence does get expanded when it works through other bodies and with international partners. I do agree that the tools out there are imperfect, but one has to work with the tools that are there. And so I think, as part of efforts towards pressure and accountability, the United States needs to sort of survey the landscape and being very realistic about the fact that if it wants to be effective in this space, there's a Human Rights Council that's actively seized with this matter and that's done a lot of good work. There's an International Criminal Court that is actively seized with this matter and has the potential to do something more, and think about ways it can support those efforts. At the same time, I do think that the United States needs to keep on talking to the civilian government, needs to keep talking to the military and helping to coax them along, as frustrating and as limited as those prospects might be at this point.
Thank you both. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ann Wagner of Missouri.
Last but not least, it's probably all been said, but we all haven't said it yet. So, Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you for hosting this hearing on a topic that I have drawn attention to again and again. I have worked with my colleague, Congressman Castro, who was here earlier this month, to send a letter to Aung San Suu Kyi urging her to commute the sentences of the two Reuters journalists who were sentenced to 7 years of jail time for investigating the Rohingya massacres. Last week, I was pleased to see that the UN finally recommended that Burmese generals be investigated for the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in the Rakhine State. This is a welcome, albeit long overdue, first step in bringing the perpetrators to justice. I am proud, really proud, that so many members in a bipartisan way of this body have not hesitated to call the violence against the Rohingya what it is. It is genocide. There is broad bipartisan consensus that the United States should be doing everything it can to prevent and end genocide. Yet, I will say that our track record is deplorable. We failed to stop genocides in Rwanda, in Syria, and now in Burma. We have waited on the sidelines as the Burmese government actively attempts to the extermination of the Rohingya. I am just beyond outraged that the officials responsible for this genocide have gone unpunished and remain unaccountable. Mr. Pomper, the International Crisis Group has done great work, and I don't mean to diminish that work in any way, but I am curious about something. In 2013, sir, your organization awarded its In Pursuit of Peace award to President Thein Sein. This award followed on the heels of a wave of crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya beginning in October 2012, which the Thein Sein government failed to adequately respond to and even encouraged. Can you elaborate on why the International Crisis Group gave this award to the man who refused to address an emerging genocide? I know that many human rights advocates at the time, because I was here in Congress, were very upset, and I remember hearing about it then. Would you like to elaborate?
So, I mean not to dodge this question, but I was ensconced in the U.S. government at that time, so I don't actually know what the thinking specifically behind the provision of that award was. I mean, as has been discussed, broadly about a lot of the sort of encouragement that different bodies inside the United States gave to different elements of the reform effort, there was a hopeful logic that was animating a lot of decision-making at that time that did not pan out clearly. But beyond that, I don't really have anything. I have literally no insight to give you. I'm sorry.
Well, if there's anything that you can find out, I know that you work closely with the organization now, obviously, and there was such outrage at the time, and it made no sense, and I just would, if there's any insight that you can provide my office or the committee, I would greatly appreciate it. And again, I don't mean to diminish in any way, shape, or form the good work that
Thank you.
that you do. The House recently passed my bill, the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, which I introduced to spur significant improvements in the way the United States responds to genocide and other crimes against humanity. One of its provisions would mandate training for Foreign Service officers in early warning and response measures. Mr. Pomper, what resources did U.S. entities on the ground lack, do you think, that impaired our response to the crisis?
Sorry, the resources that the entity, I didn't quite follow the question.
Well, my legislation provides that Foreign Service officers in early warning and response measures, they would have to be schooled up in their crisis prevention on these kinds of things. Were there other things that at the State Department level, at the U.S. level, that we could have done in response to this crisis that were lacking on the early side of this?
The early warning, gosh, I don't have a particularly complete answer for you, but I don't, honestly, I think that there had been, I don't see this as a function, frankly, of the United States' failure to see what was happening. I think this is really a function of a premeditated plan on the part of the Tatmadaw that they were determined
I'm
to
just
carry out.
concerned that our Foreign Service officers have the kind of training on the front side of these kinds of crises when it comes to warning and response measures. So
let me be supportive of that. I certainly think that, every time we cross a threshold like we've crossed right now of an atrocity happening where, it was not possible to prevent it, it's important to take stock of the toolbox and make sure that the United States is doing everything it can, that it has all the resources that it can muster to do better the next time. And so if there's a way to get more training and resources into the sort of effort of prevention, that is certainly a worthwhile.
Well, I hope to take a look at the legislation. It will be signed into law, and it's a good first step in the right direction. I've run out of time. Ms. Van Susteren, thank you for being here. I have some questions for you too. We'll submit it for the record. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you. I think this has been a very informative hearing, and I think you surfaced many bits of information about this because of your firsthand knowledge of being there. And let me just concur with you, Greta, on your observation that one of the most important things we can do here is try to get this information out, not just to the American people, but to the world. And that's one of the things you're trying to do.
And can I just add one thing? Is that
Absolutely.
Just a personal standpoint, is that I really appreciate this because I know this hearing back home probably doesn't play, the people across America probably don't, this is not going to help you in any way. You're doing this for all the right reasons. You know what I mean? There's no politics in this one. It's just to help people because if we don't get any more money out of this, the U.S. government, nobody gets anything out, but we just get a chance to maybe do the right thing.
We just hopefully get some level of humanity for those who've been through this and some hope for their future for all the reasons that you've detailed out, besides the horror of what we've been through and the fact that we've made a commitment on this issue of genocide. As they say, never again, and here it is going on with the international community held spellbound in the middle of it. So thank you to both of you for what you're doing to try to drive awareness on this issue and drive action on this issue. And thank you to the members for being here today, and we stand adjourned.
Thank you for your card's like mine.